Maria, would you like to make your presentation?
Okay, thank you, Robin. Thank you all for coming. So, Robin opened that topic of communist crimes, and I'm going to say something more about that. So, any discussion about communist crimes in Croatia must inevitably touch on the Second World War, especially the last year of the war and the immediate afterward, when these crimes reached their peak. As the end of the war approached, it became clear that the victory of the partisan movement and the resurrection of the Yugoslav state under communist leadership is imminent. The expected victory and the direct support of the Soviet Union, which the partisans enjoyed during the last months of the war, thanks to the arrival of the Red Army on the Yugoslav borders, were a signal to the communists that it was no longer necessary to hold the publicly proclaimed policy of respecting diversity of opinions and political affiliations. Although in public they still hid behind democratic principles and an emphasis on the nationwide and pluralistic concept of the partisan movement, they actually started to consolidate their monopoly of power. This in turn meant the removal of all obstacles and the cleansing of all actual and potential opponents. Beneath the slogan of the struggle against the fascists and domestic traitors and the punishment of war criminals, the communists conducted systematic purges in areas they occupied, not liberated, which meant not only arrests and court-martials of those who were labeled as opponents, but also non-judicial liquidations, and the pattern of behavior was the same throughout the restored Yugoslav state. The consequence was the mass liquidation of all those who were considered as enemies by the communists. So, according to some calculations, in savage purges in Serbia in the autumn of 1944 and at the beginning of 1945, at least 70,000 people were killed. The previously mentioned number could be found in the works of Serbian historian Srđan Cvetković, who wrote that, quote, extra-institutional purges and violence in Eastern Europe, including Serbia and Yugoslavia, generally were not the outcome of excesses or a state of emergency, but rather part of meticulously worked out revolutionary plan. Political violence here was conducted in the stages. In the first phase, this was done under the pretense of reckoning with war criminals and collaborationists. In the second, under the guise of persecution of spies and traitors, and in the third phase, under the pretext of eliminating in the party's own ranks. Having enclosed the circle of terror, with time this grew into permanent, comprehensive, and ideal system of repression that endured for decades. Cvetković added that, quote again, among those executed, certainly many were eliminated as political and class enemies of the revolutionary authorities, members of pre-war political, cultural and social elites, members and even just sympathizers of the defeated side in the civil war. What Cvetković said could be applied to the situation in Croatia, so the editors of several volumes on documents on partisan and communist repression and crimes in Croatia from 1944 to 1946 stated that the documents they published in their volumes show that the Communist Party denied civil and political liberties, private property, free market, and suppressed traditional values such as religion and national or ethnic heritage. All those who did not understand this in time were politically and legally persecuted. The communist reckoning with real and presumed opponents without any distinction, institutional or extra-institutional, during the war or after it, was massive and merciless. The hammer of the party, whose task was to execute the purges and persecution of the enemies of the people, was OZNA, in Croatian or in Serbian, Odjeljenje za zaštitu naroda, or the Department for the Defense of the People. And in September 1946, Bogdan Radica, a Croatian intellectual and dissident who had the chance to spend several months in Tito's Yugoslavia during 1945, so Radica was, how to say, promoting Tito's movement in the United States during the war, and as, how to say, useful idiot returned to Yugoslavia at the beginning of 1945 to serve in the Ministry of Information. So he spent several months in Yugoslavia as official, but with open eyes, so he could see what was going on. And then he decided to leave Yugoslavia, actually to escape it in the fall of 1945. So already in 1946, he published his, let's say, memoirs on what was going on in Yugoslavia. And in his article entitled Yugoslavia Today, that was published in the New Republic in September 1946, he mentioned the statements of three prominent communists who labeled OZNA as the most precious achievement of the War of National Liberation, because OZNA has completely fulfilled its task, terrifying all our enemies, discouraging them completely. Radica added that OZNA guards the citizen's soul and body. It only liquidates the enemy, it also converts recalcitrants through spiritual exercises. These persons are kidnapped, but well treated and coached by commissar to make them useful tools of the regime. They are indoctrinated with the belief that only one idea, the party's idea, is right. OZNA has on file data on its victims' friends, literary and artistic tastes, sex life, etc. After the liberation of Yugoslavia, OZNA arrested large numbers of people in every village and town. After 3 weeks of such liberation, Zagreb's jails held 70,000 prisoners. And this in a town believed strongly pro-partisan. So that number he mentioned probably is not true or correct, but it's possible to assume that somehow that number was circulating among the people of Zagreb. It is even possible that the authorities, put it into circulation by gossips and actually also to terrify people, At that time, Zagreb was the city of some 250 up to 300,000 people. And can you imagine, in such a city, you have 70,000 people in jail. So everybody must be terrified if by knowing that fact or that information. So Radica also said that I know from personal observation that many of those arrested were indeed Democrats, while fascists were going free. For the real enemies of OZNA are not the fascists but the progressives, the Democrats who refuse to swallow the party line. OZNA victims have told me that they are not always beaten or tortured. They are sometimes merely forced to spend the night before an examination standing up, so that by the morning they are sufficiently exhausted to confess. Those convicted are not executed, but kept in secret camps, without being permitted to communicate with their families. It is not astonishing that some idealistic communists think that what one communist woman told me. When our comrades organized OZNA at the island of Vis, we were surprised and ashamed. We did not understand the need for it. We thought that the majority of the people were with us and that there was not necessity for secret police. But these idealistic communists are also powerless. What can they do? A totalitarian doctrine is inevitable in its execution. In the totalitarian communist movement, OZNA is the heritage of the people. These are things that go beyond the concepts of morality. OZNA is omnipotent. It is Moloch who needs hundreds of thousands of victims. So this is what Radica said or wrote about OZNA already in September 1946. So, and the American public could read it already at that time. So no one can say that things were not known also at that time. Croatian historian Zdenko Radelić, in his work on OZNA in Croatia from 1944 to 1946, which was published in 2012, points out that the retaliation that is characteristic of all wars was not only a measure to punish members of the defeated armies and states, but also a step in consolidating the power of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, which reduced the number of communist opponents. Mass executions of enemy soldiers speak of this. OZNA had two approaches. It organized mass reprisals and at the same time tried to limit the arbitrariness of individual Yugoslav army units in punishing prisoners. However, arbitrariness was not strictly punished, so it can be said that it was tolerated. Except during the war operations, mass executions without trial were also carried out after the establishment of the democratic federal Yugoslavia government was established. Retribution was also carried out for trials without respecting the usual legal procedure and often without respecting the actual individual guilt. Therefore, the judiciary played a significant role in the implementation of the party's policy of purges of all undesirable elements. Considering the arbitrariness of proceedings against enemies of the people that often ended with death sentences and confiscation of property that passed into the hands of the state, it can be said that the Yugoslav Communist judiciary also participated to a significant extent in the perpetration of communist crimes. So Bogdan Radica, in the previously mentioned article that was published in September 1946, pointed out that as OZNA is the greatest power in the country, Yugoslav justice is merely an instrument to enforce the government's will. Judges are mainly men who have not studied law but are trusted by the party. This popular justice is largely used to strip the moneyed class of their property and provide the state funds without having to resort to an open and complete capital levy. It is not surprising then that in the fall of 1945, a series of staged trials were held in Zagreb and in other places in Croatia, whose main goal was to eliminate the elite of Croatian economy, to strip it both of its property and in many cases also of their lives, so the liberation of their lives. For example, the management of the then largest Croatian bank, Prva Hrvatska štedionica, or the first Croatian savings banks, was also brought before the court. After the verdict, the property was confiscated and the savings banks was liquidated. So that was opus operandi of communists, how to take away the property and put it in their own hands. The Catholic Church was among the institutions that were subjected to fierce communist persecution even during the war. There is no doubt that the communist view of religion played a significant role in the persecution of the Church. So it was in September 1946, in a lecture held in the Students' House in Zagreb, when Vladimir Bakarić, then leading figure of the state and the party in Croatia, spoke about the attitude of the communist authorities, actually the Communist Party of Croatia, as the ruling factor in our country towards religion and the Church. So he said in that lecture that, and actually it's important to say that this lecture was held in the atmosphere created by the public campaign against Archbishop Stepinac, and in anticipation of his being brought before the Communist Court, Bakarić dedicated to the views of Friedrich Engels and Lenin on religion, drawing attention to Lenin's thoughts on the fight against religion. There is therefore no doubt that the views of the Communist Party of Croatia relating to religion were based on the thoughts of Marxist-Leninist classics, as it was often said with the mandatory addition of Stalin's name. And so it is also without doubt that the persecution of the Church and the Archbishop was largely based on such ideological foundations. The real attitude of the communist authorities towards the Church came to the fore already in autumn 1944. Actually, Robin said something about it already, when Tito's partisan forces occupied the whole of Dalmatia. In March 1945, Evelyn Waugh, a British captain at that time, but also writer and ardent Catholic, who had previously spent several months with the partisans in Croatia as a member of the British military missions, stated that the partisans followed, as he said, the recent example of Russia of tolerating the church, rather than repeat the original Bolshevik mistake of waging open war against the church. But he felt that their real intention was without question the abolition of church religion, as he said. They were expecting to achieve that by indirect methods, principally by interfering as much as possible with the training of young priests and by stamping out religious education of the schools. Waugh also spoke in his statements and reports about the killing of priests and monks, and during his stay in Croatia, he not only found out much about the persecution of the church, but also about the authorities' actions toward all those who they thought were not in support of the new order. At the end of February 1945, just after leaving Dalmatia, he said to the U.S. envoy to the Holy See, Myron Charles Taylor, that in Dalmatia, which had entirely been in the hands of the partisans from the autumn of 1944, there were unmistakable signs such as the shooting of 14 or more priests and the closing of seminaries that partisans there intended gradually to suppress Catholic Church, and that this intention would be carried out over the whole of Croatia as the Germans retired. Based on his knowledge of the situation in Dalmatia and Herzegovina, Waugh estimated that 8 priests were killed in Šibenik, 10 in Split, 14 in Dubrovnik, and 6 in the Franciscan province of the Most Holy Redeemer. At the same time in Mostar, so in Herzegovina, Waugh said there were 45 friars and diocesan priests killed. Similar reports of communist action and the suffering of the church spread simultaneously among Croatian priests and among those who found themselves in Rome at the end of 1944 and early 1945. In 3 reports on the state of affairs in Croatia and the position of the Catholic Church and the end of 1944 and early 1945, much of what came out of Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina was listed and contained frightening news about the communist treatment of the church. Among these news were ones about the killings and the persecution. So in the report on the position of the Catholic Church in Croatia, or in Croatia and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, under the partisan regime of Marshal Tito, it was pointed out that although no one could give an exact number of those who were killed, according to the data so far obtained, it could be said that 120 priests were killed and maybe more. Certainly among the names of those killed were those of the Franciscans from Široki Brijeg, in Herzegovina, whom the members of the People's Liberation Army of Yugoslavia, after the end of the battle for that place in Herzegovina, brought out of the basement where they had taken refuge, and then killed without any trial on 8 February 1945. In both cases, and particularly in the case of friars from Široki Brijeg, the communist authorities subsequently labeled the victims as criminals to justify their own crimes. This is also mentioned in a contemporary British report, which says that in order to calm down the great unrest of the people following the massacre, the partisans spread the rumor that the friars had died in battle, fighting with rifles and machine guns. It is clear that this is a shameless lie. It is enough to point out that the friars died on 8 February, more than 10 hours after the end of the battle, and the most of the killed were not in the monastery while the battle lasted. So, in spite of the fact that regime already during the war tried to suppress the influence of the church that way, to, how to say, take over also the church, actually communists were not successful in that. So in 1946 they tried even to remove the head of the Catholic Church in Croatia and Yugoslavia by putting on trial Archbishop Sepinac under false accusations and condemned him to spend several years in prison, but even that was not successful. So by the end of their rule in Croatia, the Communist Catholic Church remained the most powerful, how to say, let's say, social institution among Croats, while all other oppositional groups and elites were removed already in 1945. So that is so far from me, and